Hello, my name is Sean Radcliffe, and in this brief presentation, I will be discussing the trial of Gerald Stanley. The Gerald Stanley case shows us a great deal about Aboriginal people and their interaction with the criminal justice system. This case illuminated many of the problems with the criminal justice system, such as racial bias, peremptory challenges, and the law of evidence. In this presentation, I will discuss how these impacted the case. But before we do this, I will begin by setting out the facts of the case. Moving forward, I will discuss the historical context and its impacts on this case, as well as highlighting land-related issues. Finally, I will conclude by providing my opinion and setting out recommendations for improvement going forward. In August of 2016, Colton Bushey, a 22-year-old man and member of the Red Pheasant Cree, was shot and killed by Gerald Stanley after he and his friends drove onto Stanley's farm. Stanley was charged with second-degree murder, but was ultimately found not guilty. The verdict was a surprise to many Indigenous people and others around Canada who felt very unhappy with the result and failed once again by the justice system. The case was very significant in Saskatchewan, and its result only furthered the divide between Indigenous people and the rest of the population. Naturally, the case was marred with controversy. To understand this case, we must first turn to the past. Canada's colonial legacy and consistent mistreatment of Indigenous peoples plays a major role in both the killing of Colton Bushey and the acquittal of Gerald Stanley. This is highlighted by Nagin Sinclair, who said, "Understanding the Indian Act, understanding how Canada has been built off the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and resources, all of that goes into the killing of Colton Bushey." From the earliest contact and Europeans aggressively seizing land, Aboriginal land, to legislation intended to harm Indigenous peoples, like the Royal Proclamation and the Indian Act, Canada has continuously and consistently shown a harmful attitude towards Indigenous peoples, and naturally this can lead to instances such as the killing of Colton Bushey. The killing of Colton Bushey occurred on Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 territory encompasses a large area of land used by Indigenous people, including the Red Pheasant Cree, for thousands of years before European arrival. Under Treaty 6, the creation of these reserves did not reflect Indigenous conceptions of treaty. Elders argue that there was no cede and surrender clause in the treaty, and that there were no words for these concepts in their languages. The perception that thefts and property damage in Treaty 6 territory have increased, and that Indigenous people are responsible on these lands, furthered racist beliefs in this area. In short, broken treaty promises, the loss of territory, fear of Indigenous youth and assumptions about criminality, and laws protecting private property all influence the result of this criminal case. Now that we've investigated the historical context as well as some of the land issues surrounding this case, we will look at the first issue of the trial, which is the law of evidence. The law of evidence is a set of rules aimed at regulating the admissibility and use of evidence in order to fairly promote the search for truth. It is at a judge's discretion to exclude evidence where its prejudicial effect outweighs its relevance or probative value. The line of questioning taken by the defense presented Bushey and his friends as dangerous and drunk Indians who in the end got what they deserved. His questioning played on stereotypes. In R.B. Williams, the Supreme Court acknowledged the existence of systemic anti-Indigenous racism in our criminal justice system and how it corrodes the reasoning process. Chief Justice McLaughlin held that racism against Aboriginals includes stereotypes that relate to credibility, worthiness, and criminal propensity. The questioning, which occurred in the trial of Gerald Stanley, was certainly aimed at discrediting Bushey and his friends, and I believe that the stereotypes that relate to credibility and criminal propensity were unfairly and unjustly admitted as evidence. After looking at the law of evidence, we can see that there was likely a clear racial bias which occurred in this case. It had a significant impact on the result. Another factor which involved race and also impacted the result of this case were the peremptory challenges. At the beginning of the trial, at least 5 persons who appeared to be Indigenous were rejected as potential jurors through the use of peremptory challenges. This resulted in an all-white jury. This is despite the fact that there was a high percentage of Indigenous people living in the area of Bushey's death and the courthouse. Not one visibly indigenous person wound up on the jury. Many people believe that this was a major factor in Stanley's acquittal. It's hard to not see this. Bushy's uncle spoke on this, and through his quote we can see how this makes it seem that indigenous people cannot be trusted to serve as jurors. This is a clear racial bias. For many, the result of the trial of Gerald Stanley was tragic, and it was a result that indigenous people were used to, once again being let down by the criminal justice system, once again feeling deprived of justice. Racial bias and peremptory challenges certainly played a major role in the result of this case. Taking this into consideration, I would suggest the elimination of peremptory challenges made on a racial basis. That is, unless it can be demonstrated that a person is being removed for more than just the color of their skin, they must stay. With regards to the admissibility of evidence, judges must consider a few questions. They must ask themselves whether the connections being drawn from the evidence are rooted in stereotypical assumptions, or whether the evidence is connected to systemic factors such as colonialism or structural racism. And finally, judges must be aware of the reasoning process and if it's being distorted by the triggering of stereotypical assumptions. Ultimately, the death of Colton Bushy is a tragedy. The trial of Gerald Stanley demonstrated many of the issues still prevalent in the justice system surrounding race. Hopefully, we can move forward from this case and learn from its lessons, using them to positively impact the future and create a more equitable and just society.